Hello, everybody. My name is Phil Carlisle, and I'm the program leader for games computing at the University of Lincoln. So I'm just going to hide that banner. So hide that one as well. So welcome to this session with my friend Alex Champandard. He's basically, I think that there's very few people who can claim to be a world leader or something, a world expert. And I'm pretty sure that I'm going to make the case for that Alex being a world expert in game AI, even though technically he's actually more interested in machine learning now. So hopefully you can see the screen. We should be live now. So I'm just going to basically sort of introduce Alex to people who don't necessarily know him. So Alex is the first time I met Alex, actually. Oh, hold on, my slides are moving by themselves. The first time I met Alex was after he'd written this book. So he's written books on AI game development, and I'm going to ask him when he wrote this because I can't quite remember when it was. But I remember reading this, and then we met for the first time discussing the website that Alex created, which was at the time like the premier resource for game AI information. So Alex spent a lot of time building up a huge knowledge base of game AI content, and that led on to lots of different things. So, for instance, Alex spoke at the game developer conference. We used to do sort of sessions together at those kind of events. And Alex actually started a series of conferences, and these became like the world's leading conference on game AI. So I think I can reasonably say that Alex is probably the leading expert in game AI now. And an interesting thing is that, so Alex has kind of moved on a little bit from game AI, but he's still considered an AI influencer. And I found this website this morning that was like the top 10 AI influencers. So I thought that was kind of a fun thing. Although you only made 7, Alex, so I'm sorry about that. But anyway,
I was number 3 at some stage.
So anyway, welcome, Alex. Thanks for doing this section.
Thanks. That was a wonderful intro.
So yeah, number 7, sadly, but I still think it's pretty good. Pretty impressive position.
Move up to number 6 after this broadcast.
Yeah. So how have you been doing? How are you shaping up? I know obviously you've just come off doing the Creative.AI thing.
Yeah. So I sort of my focus has changed very much to Creative.AI. So I think of game AI as just a subset of Creative.AI as a whole. So if you think of Creative.AI splitting up into the more, let's say, the more interactive part and the more procedural generation part. So you can see how both of those kind of overlap with all of the stuff I've been doing in games. But it seemed to me like there was a big need for bringing these kinds of ideas and technologies to the broader creative industries, and to not just game developers, but artists and visual designers. And so that's what we've been working on.
Yeah, so I saw a paper at AIIDE probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago, right? By guys at Microsoft Research. That it was something like it's unwieldy and takes a lot of time, where they interviewed a whole bunch of game developers and asked them essentially what problems they were facing for doing AI for games. And that really made me sort of think back to our discussions about all of these kind of different technologies, and the fact that it didn't feel like we were making an awful lot of progress a lot of the time, right? We were still talking about these same technologies years and years later. What do you think about that? Do you think there is like progress being made there still, or do you think we're still struggling with understanding what the problem set is?
I mean, I'd love to see that paper. I'm curious as to what the answers were first. That would help calibrate things.
I gave some sort of interesting research areas to look at for people who are kind of interested in the area, but it was just a good resource for like actually hearing from real game developers, because a lot of the time researchers tend to be a bit disconnected, I think. So yeah.
So my take on that is that I think game AI probably around 2008 and 2009 reached a stage where it was just good enough, and that meant that all the other things that happen when you make a game just become more important because, well, it's no longer the case that your NPCs are struggling to move from A to B or to play animations correctly. In some ways, I think we're actually going backwards, because if you look at recent releases, it seems like the complexity of building a big AAA game with hundreds of core developers and maybe even thousands of contributors is just such a difficult production that everything suffers, and the AI that you look at in recent games might actually be going backwards because it is so difficult to catch all these things.
Yeah, I've been playing Cyberpunk myself, and
That's the
like,
one I was
I'm
thinking.
kind of feeling that way. It's like, well, it feels like it's gone a little bit backwards in some way. They're doing a lot of dialogue and those kind of things, and it always feels a little bit clunky to me, like there's something missing there. So anyway, I wanted to ask you sort of this transition period, right? You've basically been a huge expert in games AI for a long time, and then I see you started this startup, sort of creative AI startup, and I'm thinking, that's interesting. I wonder what sort of drove you to do that transition. What was the sort of idea of this startup? Because I couldn't quite understand what it was you were going for when I looked at the webpage.
So a lot of that just came out of the events we were organizing. So I worked in games as a programmer at Rockstar like 15 years ago, and then I worked for Guerilla Games on the Killzone franchise for a bit as well. A bunch of consulting, contracting in between. But I think the most important part, at least for me, was the conference and how people came together. And it seemed to me like the best events that we had were always the ones where we drew in all this multidisciplinary experience, even from different fields like animation and movies and simulation, and bringing everyone together and talk about, okay, well, what is it really that game AI developers are working on? What's the core here? And it's actually much bigger than what you might think just as an AI programmer working on a single game. I think those ideas are very much applicable to other domains and other spaces. So the idea with Creative AI was to take a lot of that knowledge that was in games. I think the games industry was probably 10 years, or maybe even more, 15 years in advance on creative industries as a whole. And so seeing how the games industry handled the transition, going from just learning how to use AI in the early days and procedural generation techniques, to having it integrated in a relatively robust and reliable pipeline that can be used by animators and designers and programmers and scripters, putting all of that together, and the skills required to make that kind of stuff happen didn't seem to be as widely spread over the whole of creative industries, and there seemed to be a nice opportunity to make that transition happen, to effectively smoothen the transition of creative industries as a whole into a world where AI and machine learning becomes much more important. I think the focus has been more on the procedural generation side of things.
Yeah, so I mean, I absolutely agree, right? The idea of content production and content creation with machine learning aid and co-creation and all those kind of things are the kind of things that excite me, really. And the kind of things that I know a lot of creative people are really interested in exploring, but they're just afraid of the technology. So thinking of it from that point of view, absolutely. So I guess the bigger question is, we've got a problem in that AI is probably a little bit misconstrued. Do you think, like the idea of AI as this kind of, I don't know, Terminator machine kind of thing, and somehow? So here's a really high level question that we're trying to answer in our research group. Is there a limit on how much creativity you can incorporate in a machine learning kind of agent? Is there some fundamental underlying thing in terms of creativity that a machine couldn't do?
Well, it depends how you define creativity, right?
Yeah.
So the definition that I like is that creativity is a conversation or communication, involves two parties. Because if you have someone that's producing a a painting, I remember going to Mexico once for Creative.AI, and there was lots of markets there, and they were selling paintings, and I thought, oh, that looks really cool. And for me, it looked like new and creative and fresh and novel, and I thought, okay, I'm going to get that. And then the moment I bought it, they took it down and gave it to me and put another one up that they got from around the back. And so from their perspective, that was not a creative act, that was mass production. But
Yeah.
the way I saw it, it was, oh, that's pretty cool. And so for me, it takes two people to define creativity. You have to have the person that's producing, consuming, the artist, and the say the observer. And so if you think of it in those terms, then the bottleneck is the bandwidth, or the figuring out what the observer is going to see in said painting, or could be a procedurally generated level, and maybe that person's never seen it before. For them it might be creative, but for someone else it isn't.
So I mean, there's kind of underlying theoretical kind of problems here, right? The reason why I ask is, you look at things like CNNs, and they've been massively influential in sort of machine learning, right? And fundamentally they solve a particular type of problem. But the bigger question is, are there other types of machine learning models, other types of structures that capture different types of aesthetics in the way that the CNNs do? It feels like fundamentally, I don't really have a very good grasp of the intuition of that, but I know that you've got a much clearer picture on the sort of production end of machine learning, right? The actual use in creativity. So my question is, are there kind of undiscovered, things like GANs and all that kind of stuff, are there undiscovered models, do you think, that will actually capture a lot of this creativity that we're talking about?
Yeah, so I think there's as many different models for machine learning as there are potential pieces of software. So there's lots of undiscovered stuff. Then you could categorize them. I think that's probably the best way to look at it. There's the convolutional networks, which work usually by operating over an image and scanning all the pixels with a 3x3 filter, and then produce things that you would recognize. That they have these distinctive look to them. You can see that they've been done with a convolution network if you know what you're looking for. And then there are other types of machine learning algorithms that work on single pixels at a time. So they're more like a shader, basically, where you do a really expensive computation for each pixel, and then it outputs some more stuff. And so that also produces a look that is quite distinctive, and you can almost tell the shapes of what the neural network has learned, and the brush strokes around the face or eyebrows. And so both of those solve different kinds of problems, but they are very distinctive. And even recently, Google found that applying, let's say, computer vision, but using natural language technology like the transformers and all of those techniques that are working well on mobile phones or in search engines, they take those and then they apply them to computer vision, and actually we get good results out of that too. So it seems like everything can be made to work in some way or another. It's just a question of what you're going for, what you need to solve, what's your goal.
So I've noticed that you've got like a GitHub with a bunch of sort of texture synthesis and super resolution kind of stuff. How do you build up that sort of intuitional knowledge about like where to apply different sort of features and those kind of things? Because that seems to me that one of the sort of challenges for anybody who's going to learn machine learning is just because it's not as clear cut as programming, right? It's not like as binary as programming. A lot of it's things like having the right data and understanding, the data that you're training on and all that kind of stuff. So how do you build up that knowledge? How have you built it up, I guess?
Well, there's two ways, I would say. Like, one is the more bottom-up approach, where you say, okay, I have this shiny hammer and I'm just going to learn to hammer things with it. And then you go around and you hammer everything you can find, and some things work and some things don't, and some things break. So that's a start. And you can do that by reading papers or grabbing code from GitHub and then taking that approach. And the other way, I think I've been doing more of that more recently in the past few years, is to just take a more top-down approach, like goal-driven in a sense, where you say, I'd like to really solve this problem and I don't know how to solve it. And that's where you sort of, it's more open field in that case. And that involves also usually building your own data sets if you need them. And then of course, it all comes back down to, you will need to pick up a hammer at some stage to solve that problem. But that comes second. The solution is a secondary thing, and the problem or the challenge that you're facing is the first thing on the list.
So you just kind of reminded me of something then. So is there, so I follow a lot of the sort of machine learning research that comes out of NVIDIA, because it's kind of the type of thing I enjoy seeing. Yeah. Is there sort of a set of people that you follow, like the work that they do, so you understand that particular area? So there's a woman called Sandra Fiedler who's a professor at like University of Toronto, but there's a lot of work with NVIDIA, and they do a lot of kind of synthetic data sets and all that kind of thing. And I think that that's actually a really important area that games technology can be applied to. So do you follow that kind of thing? I mean, I usually stop on Twitter, right? Is that the kind of thing you do?
Yeah, Twitter is the place to go. I follow pretty much everyone that has tweeted at some stage some paper relating to creativity or computer vision, machine learning, generative stuff. I will just follow them and add them to my list. And that's the best source for me. There was a time where I used to go directly to archive. So that's archive with an X, archive.org, to read the papers directly there. And I would go there every morning and just do a keyword search and find the ones that I found interesting. And that's something I do less of now, because the research is just scattered a lot, and it feels less. Any single paper is less influential, and the influential ones end up on Twitter anyway.
Right. So you use like people to filter it out for you.
Yeah. I mean, if you're learning, it's a really good phase to go through, is basically reading every single paper on the topic for the past 3 months that you can find on archive. There's a few.
Yeah. So in case anybody's watching, like I think it was 2,000 papers from Europe's last week, 2,000 accepted papers. Trying to read all of those is probably not a very good idea. So Alex mentioned archive. There's a thing called Archive Insights, which is basically a search engine for archive that'll actually allow you to select particular topics. So it's a way of filtering out. It was by, I think, the guy who does the AI for Uber or something. One of the really top sort of AI researchers did that site just to sort of help himself. So
yeah, there was another one called Archive Sanity with a dash in it.
Right, the Carpathy one, yeah.
Yeah. And so that's pretty good, because you can search for specific paper and it will give you relations to the closest ones that it finds. So then when you find like a string to pull on, you basically get 20 papers for free if you just keep going.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? We're talking about a field that's got a huge amount of effort, I guess, really. And filtering out just that one particular thing that interests you is definitely a skill to get, I think. So talking about this kind of the amount of effort going into machine learning right now, which is like, if you actually look at any of the big conferences, is a huge, like billions and billions of dollars being thrown at. What do you think of things like GPT-3, where they're literally training models that are beyond the scope of lots and lots of companies, right, and individuals especially? Like, how do you view that whole, I guess, that whole ethical problem of like, only massive corporations can afford to do this thing anymore?
Well, I think it's interesting because they probably got all their data from scraping the internet and basically ignoring copyright. So the only reason it works is because they've basically discarded the copyright licensing, and they've decided that our model is now free of any of these copyright restrictions, and that they're okay with that. So it's kind of like some form of ethics washing, where they just they say, okay, well, every single piece of data has got such a small claim on the output, therefore we're going to ignore it, which is a very questionable line. And I wonder if that's not the main reason why OpenAI actually license this tech exclusively to Microsoft, so that
Yeah, I
Microsoft can
saw
do
that.
the
I thought, oh,
distribution.
that's interesting.
And I think Microsoft has just got the legal teams, and they can probably handle it. They've got they can figure
Right,
out
yeah.
all the implications of this. I'm sure there's stuff that this model produces that is just not appropriate, or is questionable, or that's legally and from a copyright perspective also not
So what do
acceptable.
you
And
think is?
Microsoft
I
has the
mean,
lawyers to deal with it.
right, yeah. So what do you think? I mean, if you see the output of GPT-3, it does kind of look a bit magic. It looks a little bit. Do you think that sort of like the use cases are being filtered quite a lot? Because the reality is that a lot of the time when you do, procedural generation, a lot of it's actually kind of rubbish, right? So maybe we're only seeing the actual sort of successful examples. Or do you think that the scale, a model of that scale is just capable of producing high quality content?
I think it comes down to the application domains, and maybe there are some domains that work better than others, and we'll see companies built on those things. And so it's kind of a self-reinforcing. If the model's good at certain things without custom data, then those things will become really obvious businesses that, well, it will be easy for new businesses to pop up based on that, but also it will be easy for your competitors to do the exact same thing.
Hmm.
So from my perspective, it seems like a ridiculous thing to build on top of GPT-3, because your competitors can probably figure out how to do that pretty trivially. And so you have no defensibility, and you basically got yourself a like 6 months to 12 months head start. As long as you're not too successful, the moment you're really successful, someone's going to just copy it and just figure out how to
I assume
make
that
it.
the sort of first mover advantage, right, where you're just in that market earlier than everybody else, so you get a bit of
Yeah,
reputation out of it.
but what happens then is that the market collapses. It goes to zero. So if all those startups are just powered by GPT-3, and one of them's charging $10 per interaction and the other one's charging one, then the market will shift.
Yeah.
It's not, you can't build that much of a reputation in the time that it takes for a competitor to just basically put a few layers of JavaScript on
I
top of
suppose there is a
GPT-3.
business model to be had there for like supporting people for integrating it, and that kind of consultancy kind of model rather than the developer model.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. That's one thing that we looked at GPT-3 for, is to actually assist the development process of creating higher quality in-house data, where the competitors would not have that access to that data. But if you use basically GPT-3 as a slightly better model, like GPT-2 plus, then you can basically bootstrap, or like it's a form of positive reinforcement on the data that you have. You can get more out of it by using this model. And that means that you would effectively think of GPT-3 as some kind of pre-production tool or production tool, but that wouldn't actually be shipped live, because it was probably too expensive to pay for queries live from your actual users. So you use that as a tool in-house, you get better data, you then train a faster, lightweight model, which costs you almost nothing, and you can deploy that on standard cloud platforms. So I think there's a lot of value there, actually, and it may be that GPT-3 is just too heavy and has no obvious benefits to being exposed directly to the user, and you might have so many ethical questions that come out of that effectively people might end up using GPT-3 just in development in-house.
Yeah. So there was a couple of things that came up there that I wanted to sort of ask about. So one of the things is that from my point of view, I use a lot of, I basically use a lot of machine learning models from other people, right? Because I'm trying to do like an ensemble way of developing. And one thing I've noticed is that commercial developers seem to be much more capable of producing essentially a compressed model, right? A model that doesn't involve huge memory and all that kind of thing. Yeah, making them work on mobile spaces. What do you think the skill set there is? How do people kind of gain that advantage? Because it feels like a lot of commercial models take the ideas from academia and actually just make it really good and sell it.
Wow, but that's a standard problem for integrating academic research into industry. That's always been there, and it's a different skill set. On the one side, maybe you're coming up with something more novel, more innovative, forward thinking, and then the other way, you're just driving it forward by bringing it to real people and deploying it in ways that everybody can use it. So I think it is a skill set, and I think also depends on the mindset of the companies that are doing this. There are companies that are very open source centric, very user focused, and they produce some really great models. There's a lot in the natural language space, text processing. There's a couple of great startups that are really leading the way in terms of producing APIs and libraries that are easy to use, easy to integrate. So that they think less cloud and more, how can this work for my users? So from that mindset comes the fact that, yeah, well, obviously this needs to fit onto most GPUs and we need to squish the size down. But I think there's a certain laziness that comes from intellectual laziness that comes from having lots of resources available, like at the big, not big academic labs, but the big corporate labs. Like at most junctures in a project, you will have the decision, say, okay, we can just take what we have, we scale it up, or we can actually think smart and then and come up with something more creative that will solve things 10 times, 100 times faster. But a lot of these branches get cut off because someone says, okay, well, it doesn't matter, we can afford the GPUs, we've got a few million, that's fine, let's just burn it. And so that is, I think, it is a tragedy in some ways, because a lot of smart programmers are just not getting the chance to solve important problems by the fact that they have these resources available.
Yeah, I mean, I was doing some cloud training for machine learning recently, and we had exactly that problem. The demonstrator was said, like, well, this would normally take a long time, so I'm going to use this massive array of servers to actually sort of show you the demonstration. It's like, well, it's a bit unfair, you know. So this idea of cloud-based machine learning is actually something that so I was at SIGGRAPH. Obviously, all of these conferences are virtual right now, and I was at SIGGRAPH this year. And one of the really key things I saw was that almost all of the creative content producers were all talking about cloud-based content production and content hosting and making it all available in the cloud. And seeing sort of examples like the Microsoft Flight Sim thing, where they've got cloud-based content production, you know, like procedural content based in the cloud, it suggests to me that, like, there's a fundamental sort of feature set of skills there, right? Things like understanding how the cloud stuff works, but also understanding the opportunities for using things like machine learning as a sort of post-process or pre-process step for content in the cloud. That seems to me like there's a shift going on in the industry right now for that kind of thing. Do you get that kind of thing yourself? Do you see that happening?
Yeah, I see it too, but I think it's more down to the fact that it's a hassle to run machine learning on users' machines, and you can't really rely on, and that's probably because of CUDA, and that like, let's say a third of people's desktops and laptops can be relied on to have CUDA. Therefore, you can't really reliably deploy models or AI-based software to people's machines as easily as you would hope. So because it's such a hassle, it's then you look at how easy it is to install Ubuntu on the server and then create some kind of WebSocket or tunnel between the client and just put it on a website. That becomes the easier option. I don't think that's going to work so well, though, because I think you miss out on a lot of... There's some benefits to having the fast turnaround times of a local application. I think it feels more tactile, more creative. So if we're looking at the next generation of tools, I think there will be more local, and maybe there will be cloud, you know, enhanced as a bonus if the cloud is available, or if not necessarily cloud, but even more peer-to-peer. If there are peers in the network that happen to provide cheap compute with green energy, then let's use those and rely less on these big sort of inefficient and gas guzzling clouds.
Yeah, there was a presentation, like NVIDIA was showing off their kind of cloud hosted GPU server farms and all that kind of things. And it's like, well, it's nice, but it's probably quite expensive to do that. So this idea of like cloud sort of procedural content production, I think there's certainly value there. And there's lots of different industries, I think, that are going to be looking at this. So I guess the question is, how do you see, because companies like Netflix, right, they naturally work in the cloud. All of their platform is basically a cloud delivery platform. And it feels to me like having things that can plug into a cloud kind of process are going to be a fundamental way of developing things. And I think you're right. Having that accessibility is really important. So there's some applications you can play with, right? Things like Art Breeder and that kind of thing. Like some models demand that tactile kind of feel, so that immediate interaction, whereas other ones could be like a process that's run overnight, like a batch process kind of thing. So how do you determine where your model would sit in that sort of continuation? I'm thinking in terms of things like GANs, and I remember seeing a tweet of yours about the fact that like an average face is not a very interesting face or something, because obviously people have been using StyleGAN and StyleGAN 2 for a while, and there's quite a lot of really interesting procedural research about understanding the latent space and the features that get changed as you're manipulating the latent space. But it's so much better if you can play with it with sliders, and like actually, if you're thinking in terms of a designer and an artist, being able to play with that in real time is a fundamental property of the system for them. So I guess the question is, how do you determine whether it needs that real time interaction versus just being an interesting thing to compute?
Well, I think, it all comes down to what you want to make, I guess. I think most things would be my answer. Most things benefit from that rapid iteration feedback. It's just more creative, it's more tactile, and most art forms have that rapid feedback. And if we can bring that from the other art forms into the creative AI machine learning space, I think will benefit. So Kate Compton has a great paper, actually a dissertation about that. She calls them casual creators. So like tightening the feedback loop and getting making things that can create something easily in the hands of a casual user. So I think most things do benefit. I think the reason why cloud tends to be the default is usually because of business constraints, and it's more defensible. Whereas if you give people a piece of software that they can install, then there's no reason for them to come back and get a new version if you did your job well. So that's why Adobe switched from shipping Photoshop versions to basically having a cloud subscription, because that is a business model for them. And so they lock you into their cloud. It takes like 5 days to upload all your photos to their cloud system. If you take them seriously with their offer to host your cloud photos, it takes a really long time to get all the data over there, which is another reason why I think that local tools processing your data locally is going to be less computationally expensive. It's going to be it's going to save a lot of bandwidth. It's going to just be cheaper on resources and better for the environment. So I see a future where we have more and more stuff locally, because that's ultimately what people want. The only reason they end up with cloud stuff is because the business models tend to be more, let's say, exploitative. And so it's not really your software. You're just renting access to it. So I don't know. That just doesn't feel very ethical to me.
Photoshop was an interesting case, though, right? Because they have got a huge amount of machine learning in there now. Like I saw a presentation at one of their.
Most of it runs locally, right? Most of it has to be run locally, because you need that feedback loop, and people need to work offline. So Photoshop is still a subscription that's tied to their cloud subscription, but most of their machine learning models, they had to optimize them to run on all the CPUs really fast.
You think that Photoshop sort of model is actually the way to go forward, right? So where I mean, what they're talking about really is kind of co-creative stuff, right? It's removing skies from photographs. Like it could be something as simple as that, but ultimately the machine learning to do that is actually quite a specialized, a set of knowledge that you have to build up over time. But I can see that that's actually a really good model of just tool sets in general, right? It's kind of AI empowered thing, but the process of generating it is partly because you've got a requirement, right? You've got a requirement to change the sky to a moody backdrop kind of thing. And there seems to be quite a lot of apps that are kind of building that, machine learning creativity thing into their sort of applications. I guess, is there something that you've seen that's been like really convincing for that?
Yeah, I think like background removal and like we call them creative skills, and at a very low level, you sort of see a lot of them are basically a textbook application of convolutional networks. You say, "Was this a background pixel? Yes, no," and then you you scan the whole image, and you see make a decision, and then remove the background or sky replacement. Yeah, there's so many recolorization. And so I think those are the kind of things that will be built up in a very bottom-up fashion, where you're just taking individual things that would normally take 3 hours for a professional in Photoshop to do. You can do that now, yeah, within seconds. You can have
Yeah, sort of blemish removal kind of thing, right? For advertising and stuff.
Yeah, so each of those things I think are, I mean, there's an endless list of the kind of problems to solve there, but they're getting better and better. And so we're sort of moving up the hierarchy of well, things that may not have been possible, let's say 2 years ago. Now you would probably consider it production quality. So that's improving, and in a very, very bottom-up fashion. So, you know, in Photoshop, there's literally thousands of menu entries with filters and plugins and actions or whatever they call them. And yeah, those are becoming more and more capable. But there's still that fundamental question of how do we make the whole application more interactive and more
so I remember you doing
use.
I saw you doing a sort of thread on Twitter recently about this whole idea of like detecting deepfakes. And,
Yeah.
and honestly, sort of thinking of it from the ethics point of view, I have been kind of a bit worried about this whole idea of eventually media being completely untrustworthy, because if we
Eventually.
take a logical conclusion, right, we should be able to generate any kind of media that we want, right? We can replace people, we can replace voices, we can, you know, replace even like, you know, world geometry and lighting and all of the things that we would rely on in a visual scene. We can start replacing all of that. And then the question is, how do you have any kind of trust in the things that you're seeing in media? So where do you stand on the ethics of those kind of problems?
Well, first of all, I think there should be a disclosure. And if some TV network or some a political party has decided to use some kind of manipulation of video, then it should be clearly signaled. And if they get caught, there should be massive fines or some repercussions to that. So then that's not happening right now. So you see, I think there's a couple of TV networks that are using deepfake type post-processing in some ways. Like you can tell when you know what you're looking for. And so they've just deployed that. Nobody really notices. Nobody really is talking about it. But that's just like probably since the start of this year almost. They've been doing this kind of stuff. And the tech is there. It's not talked about because the debate about deep fakes is still stuck, let's say 4 years ago, where it was about you cut out this part of the face and then you paste in someone else's face and it looks so ridiculous. It's basically a really low quality face swap.
Yeah.
So the online detectors and online tools are still stuck at trying to detect these really cheap alterations. So the Netflix documentaries have been interesting. Some of them, like I think Al Pacino was like a younger version of himself through deepfake, and one of the was it The Irishman?
Yeah, right. It was in yeah, I know what you mean.
So that's interesting because there's definitely there's an uncanny valley there, and so the problem is that they're trying to generate stuff at a really higher resolution with like close shots, whereas in TV you can get away with, you know, most stuff is badly compressed and uploaded to YouTube at 1080p, and the face just might end up being 540p, and so you cannot tell if it's real or fake or not. Whereas the debate about Netflix, okay, this doesn't really look so good, and it's missing the point. The fact is, it's already good enough to pass on TV, and most people would never notice it.
Yeah, I suppose, sorry, I suppose the bigger question is, like, these TV companies essentially have to run on a shoestring budget anyway, right? So if they can produce content.
No, I'm talking about the big ones. I'm talking about massive TV networks. They have the budget, and they probably have teams of like computational media, like it's basically new forms of editing tools, where instead of editing like by cutting stuff out or selectively cropping or changing the lighting, you're effectively manipulating overall perception of someone's face. So I think that's already happening, but it's not really being disclosed or discussed at all.
Yeah. So how do we manage that whole process of, I mean, obviously there's value in the sort of detection of those things, but it feels like it's the wrong way around, right? We're detecting artifacts after the fact that they've done the damage, right? It's not. Do you think that there's maybe the platforms will have to sort of start things like authenticating media and those kind of things?
I don't think it's possible. I mean, we'll just end up with fact checkers, and they're basically well, they could be wrong. And
well, it's a recursive problem, right? Who fact checks the fact checkers, and then who fact checks them?
Yeah, who funds the fact checkers? And if it's the same people that are investing in the social media companies that are funding the fact checkers, how can you trust either of them? So I don't think that's the solution.
Where does this end up then? What do we end up sort of doing? Do we just accept that media's basically unreliable?
Yeah, I think that's a good conclusion. I would move more towards local politics and politicians that you can shake their hands and go and see their speeches, and there will be a shift towards more local politics. And I don't mean nationalism. I just mean the mayor of your city, village, will just be more important, have more responsibility, more power. And when there are important decisions or speeches being made, then that needs to be done in person with people there that are checking, not just some Zoom broadcast that could have been pre-recorded and edited after the fact, right? So the idea that you have this massive disconnect between what's happening in people's lives and the theater that is politics, we don't know how real it is, and we never will. Maybe I don't think technology can help us detect fake from real. So I see this as an inevitable move towards more local politics.
I certainly hope so. Do you ever feel the sort of ethical responsibility for these kind of things, right? Because we're basically working in an area where these tools that we're working on can be manipulated in that way, right? Where I guess the Oppenheimer thing, right? Where you're working on a technology, you're working on in an area that could potentially be misused. So what do you think about that?
Well, it's a bit like it feels a bit like the ad tech business, and the people that know ad tech just realize how much data we have on everyone and how easily you can be tracked online and targeted and sent specific adverts or even behavioral modification. It's the kind of stuff we only really touched upon slightly with Creative.AI, and we managed to keep our distance, luckily. But I think deepfakes is a similar thing. Like, experts in the field just know how important this tech is, how far it's become, and I think a lot of the perception of it is years behind. And in the same way that people think, oh, ad tech, it can't be that bad, but people that actually know realize, well, this is a weapons grade stuff. And it's the same with deepfakes. I think, we've reached a stage where I think education is the biggest problem.
So you think educating the public about the sort of capabilities of some of these algorithms is probably the best way of dealing with it? At least they're understanding that, like, they can be manipulated. And I think you're absolutely right. Like, you can see digital manipulation, especially in politics, like you can see obvious examples. Just simple things like speeding up and slowing down a video ends up being hugely problematic. And that's a really, really simplistic technique. Like, we think of all of these really, actors that are being paid millions to develop these new techniques for manipulation, like, say, ad tech, and having immense amounts of data about people. It does feel like there's kind of, how would you frame it? There's like a sense that we need to arm ourselves with information about how all of this stuff could potentially work, just to even have a sense of how we're being manipulated, just to have an overall viewpoint on it, right?
I think that battle has been lost already. I think it's too late. I'm sorry to say.
Oh dear.
I think the the smoothest way to recover some functional government is to shift as much responsibility as possible to local level. So yeah, I'm not convinced that can be fixed. And I think people need to realize it's a problem first, right? So I think as soon as people realize, then they will think it through, and they'll come to the conclusion the only people that are making decisions over my life should be people that I can meet and who are accountable, and that I can, I know who to turn to when stuff is not getting done like it was promised, and that sort of accountability is no longer there anymore.
It never really occurred to me that, but yeah, that sounds like a really good idea. Like actually holding the people who've got power over you to account by personally being there with them. Yeah.
Well, if they've got power over you, that means you gave away that power somehow. So it's somehow a contractual relationship, right? So if you agree to provide your taxes, then they provide something in return. And if they're not delivering or misguiding people through the use of whatever technology, then they're not fulfilling their part of the contract. So yeah.
So we're almost out of time, sadly. So I guess the last question really is where are you heading now? What's the kind of feeling that you're moving towards? Obviously not trying to give anything away, but
no, that's fine. I don't mind.
You've sort of finished with Creative.AI now, right? Is that right?
So Creative.AI went through a startup phase, which we basically did the usual thing and got some funding. We got 2.2 million in funding. And then we sort of did all the things that were expected from startups, and it really did not work as well as we hoped it would. In fact, it was quite a mess, and it was interesting to hear because we're not the only company that's gone through this sort of mismatch in expectations from the different sides involved. But I think my biggest takeaway from that whole experience has been just how fundamental, let's say, stress is in this whole equation. And I see stress as the opposite of creativity. So where you have stress, you see everything's closed and sort of you're less free to express yourself or to acknowledge ideas, whereas creativity is the more open phase where you can just really take advantage of all the opportunities around you. And the world is really set up in a very stressful way. Most of work in general, a lot of our tools are really stressful. And so you sort of look at this from the perspective of trying to bring more creativity into the world, either using augmented systems or just from people, from machines. The biggest part of the problem is actually releasing that stress, making people feel more at ease. And in some ways, I think 2020 has been an extremely stressful year for me personally, but also in general. I think I see a lot of people struggling, and that is sort of, if you look forward and say, hey, we would like to build tools to make people more creative, well, you can't really even have that discussion because there's such a big, strong basis of stress there. So you have to figure out, okay, how are we going to address this? What kind of tools can we build that will make people's lives just easy enough that they can then, start being more creative again? And so a lot of that is sort of trying to address the job situation. Like there are, queues of people lining up in person or in cars at food banks, and like joblessness is at record high. And you're sort of thinking, well, is a tool that makes part of the population more creative going to be received well when there's so many people just struggling on levels of the pyramid, Maslow pyramid of needs, like if they're right at the bottom of like struggling for shelter and food, then you sort of look at it as a systemic problem. So that's a long answer to try and say that we're trying to build a new kind of company that will help more people find their place, and the people that lost their jobs because, well, capitalism is certainly having a rough time, and may continue to have a rough time throughout the next year. Like, how do we build kind of companies that are more like communities that support and help each other and grow, and that where like stress reduction is like the primary goal, and once we've got there, we can talk about how do we take it further. So we're trying to do that with photographers in mind, because that's been an interesting use case for us, because the whole photography industry has been completely decimated. Like the transition to digital and stock photography, and then now AI, each of those waves has sort of collapsed the whole professional market, and you can't really make money full-time professional as a photographer unless you have a really standout branding. So there's a whole like set of people that are just now having to focus on stuff that they maybe enjoy less, like not as much as photography. How can we find ways to create new jobs and new avenues for creative expression? So that's a big challenge for me. I see this sort of there's a lot of diametrically opposed forces with like wanting to be more efficient, Uber style gig economy, but that sort of makes things more stressful, less creative. So how can we balance that out by creating new types of organizations?
That sounds, yeah, that sounds like a really hard task. So yeah, I'm glad somebody's tried to do it at least. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think you're right. The sort of creative freedom and enjoyment of being creative is part of the reason why I still kind of like creating things. Right, I like imagining things and them existing. So I always get driven by the creative, and I always get put off by the administrative and the, sort of money and all of the other stuff. So yeah, I agree. Okay, well, I think we're just about out of time. We've maybe got a little bit of time for questions, but I haven't seen any questions in the chat. So if we haven't got any more questions, I guess, is there any message that you would like to give to, if people are sort of tuning in and thinking about a career in like AI, what advice would you give them to sort of get started?
Well, I would recommend just doing stuff that you find fun and exciting and stimulating. And it's easy to get dragged into, okay, your mom says you've got to become a lawyer, and your dad says you must be a doctor. But those are things, basically, if that's fun to you, go ahead and totally do it. But don't do stuff because other people are telling you to do it. Just find what you think is, okay, this is awesome, it resonates with me, then you go for it. And those are the kinds of things that, in general, you will get 10 times the results doing the kind of stuff that you really want to do. Than compared to the kind of stuff that other people are telling you to do, just because they didn't do it and they're trying to push that onto you somehow. And so for me, that's led me into building tools for people to be more creative and trying to empower creatives in general. And I think there's really a lot of fun to be had there. But ultimately, it took me quite a few years to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. But when you've got that, it unlocks, you just become more. You become more yourself, and you become therefore more creative and a better service to others around you. So that's the place where to start. Like if you follow your heart and you see what resonates the most, you might not hit the exact thing that you want to do for the rest of your life immediately. Just keep going. All the cool stuff that your brain thinks about and that seems to be right, then just go for it. There's so many tools and resources out there, GitHub and tutorials and online courses, that you can pick up this kind of stuff probably within 6 months, a year. You can really have a good level of expertise. So just keep going. And
yeah, I would definitely echo that. The idea of sort of following things that you're really interested in, because you'll always put more of yourself into them, and you'll actually. And Alex is absolutely right. I've learned this as well. Is that you kind of learn to be more of yourself over time. You learn what interests you and what excites you, and you kind of pursue it more. And so if you can get yourself into a position where you start, investigating the things that you are excited about and you start passionately following them, that's always a good sign. And people will respond to that in kind, right? They like people who are enthusiastic about things, and they employ people that are enthusiastic about things. So getting that enthusiasm for yourself, and obviously it's a personal journey, right? It's not everybody's going to have exactly the same experience, but ultimately pursuing the thing that you want, the thing that excites you, absolutely. I would say that, education's all about that kind of thing. So I absolutely agree with you there, Alec. So I think we're out of time. So I just wanted to sort of say thanks again, Alex, for doing this.
Sure,
I'm
it's a
looking forward to
pleasure.
seeing your next tweets about the next company and what you're going to do. Photography is an interesting area. Obviously, things like videography and those kind of things are still there as well. So, yeah, sounds great.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks for the invitation. I hope everyone got something out of it.
Yeah, I'm sure they did. Anyway, thanks again, Alex. And well, I think
Take
we'll
care.
end the broadcast now.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye, everybody.